Danny called on a Tuesday, not a text, not a voice message I could listen to twice before deciding how to feel. He called, and I heard his voice, and I stood in the depot parking lot with a clipboard in my hand and didn't say anything for a full 3 seconds. "I'm coming home," he said. "End of the month, if that's all right." I told him it was more than all right. I told him Cal had been asking about him. I told him his old room was still his old room. I didn't tell him anything else. That's not how we were built. Danny is my younger brother by 7 years. He went in at 19, 2 tours, Kandahar the first time, Mosul the second, and came back a different shape. Not broken, not the way people say it carelessly, just rearranged. Like the furniture of who he was had been moved in the dark, and nobody had gotten around to putting it right. That was 11 years ago. I spent the first 2 of those years watching him from a careful distance, the way you watch a fire you're not sure is going out or going somewhere worse. I called. I visited when he'd let me. I kept Cal out of it until Cal was old enough to ask his own questions, and I looked quietly and without any announcement for the thing that might actually help. I found Lakeview in year 3. The Lakeview Veterans Reintegration Center sits on the west side of Dunmore, Ohio, a converted brick building on 4 acres, backed up against a stand of white oaks that look, in October, like they're on fire. The director at the time was a man named Theodore Birch, a Vietnam-era chaplain who'd spent 30 years figuring out that what veterans needed wasn't treatment so much as traction, a reason to have somewhere to be, a community that didn't require explaining yourself. I sat in Ted's office for 2 hours the first visit. He had a military photo on the wall behind him, a younger version of himself, jaw like a bridge support, somewhere green and hot, and a desk covered in grant paperwork that had the particular look of paperwork nobody was ever going to approve. He made bad coffee and didn't apologize for it, which I respect. I asked him what he needed. He told me. A building that didn't leak, a second counselor, and enough stability to stop worrying about the lights staying on. He said it matter-of-factly, the way men his age named hard things, not asking for sympathy, just stating the load. I asked how much. He told me. I told him I could help with that. I didn't tell him my name. I told him my brother's. What I had wasn't a fortune. It was a software patent, a routing optimization system I'd built on my own time, back when I was still doing logistics consulting, before the depot, before Carol died, before Cal was old enough to need consistency more than I needed ambition. I'd spent 3 years building that system. In the evenings after Carol went to sleep, on a laptop at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me. She knew what I was doing. She never once told me to stop. I'd sold it to a freight tech company in 2013 for enough that, invest carefully and drawn down slowly, could run a modest program for a very long time. The check cleared 4 weeks after Carol's funeral. I signed the first donation transfer the same afternoon. I don't know why I remember the order of those things. I just do. I never thought of it as sacrifice. You don't when it's your brother. You just do the math and you move the money. Danny came to Lakeview in year 4. He didn't know I'd had anything to do with it. A mutual friend had suggested it, or that's what Danny thought. He stayed 6 months the first time. He came back for a second stint 2 years later. He got his footing there. He made friends. He started helping with intake assessments for new residents, because Ted said Danny had a way of making men feel like arriving was the right decision. By year 7, Danny was on staff. He ran intake assessments 3 mornings a week. Ted told me, in his oblique way, that Danny had become the person new residents wanted to talk to first. Not the counselors, not the director, but the man who'd been where they were and come out the other side carrying something useful. I didn't tell Danny I knew any of that. I found out the same way I found everything out about Lakeview. I read the annual reports Ted sent to the donor address, which was a P.O. box in Dunmore I checked twice a year. By year 11, Danny was ready to come home. I didn't know, when he called that Tuesday, that someone else was coming to Dunmore at the same time. Ellison Logistics Technology acquired us on paper in March. The depot, Moss Regional Freight, 22 years old, 11 drivers, a loading dock that was older than me and more reliable, wasn't a trophy. We were a gap filler, a regional node their routing system needed. Mara Ellison was the CEO, and from what I could tell, she hadn't built her company by wasting time on sentiment. She came to finalize things in person. That was her style. Apparently, she didn't send lawyers alone. I met her in the conference room on a Thursday morning. She was maybe 45, dark hair pulled back, a suit that cost more than my truck. A handshake that told you she'd done this 100 times and intended to be somewhere else by noon. She looked at me the way people look at a piece of equipment they're taking possession of. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Noting make, model, condition. I'd been the dispatcher here for 9 years. Before that, I'd owned the patent. Before that, I'd built it. But she didn't know any of that, and there was no reason she should. We talked through the terms. I answered her questions. Her acquisition team was in and out of the building for 2 days. Logistics audits, driver interviews, routing assessments. Standard. I made coffee. I answered questions. I stayed out of the way when staying out of the way was the professional thing to do. On the second day, one of her team members, a young woman named Priya, earnest and thorough, asked if they could do a site visit to the Lakeview facility. The depot had a community partnership with them. We'd donated fleet maintenance hours for 3 years running, and it showed up in our filings. I said, of course. I didn't think about it beyond that. I was in the loading dock the next morning, working through a routing discrepancy with one of our drivers, when Mara Ellison walked back in alone. Not with Priya, not with the lawyers, alone, in a different coat than the day before, and with a look on her face I hadn't seen in the conference room. She stood at the dock entrance for a moment before she said anything. "Your name is on the donor wall at Lakeview." I set down the clipboard. "Founding donor," she said. 11 years, Moss Regional Freight, with a Dunmore address. "And your first name?" I didn't say anything right away. "My brother was a resident there," she said. 2 years ago. His name is Owen. He was in a bad place. He'd been in a bad place for a long time, and nothing had worked. And someone told him about Lakeview, and he went, and it was the thing that finally," she stopped. I waited. The loading dock was quiet. One of my drivers had pulled out 20 minutes ago, and the next truck wasn't due for an hour. Just the two of us and the cold and the particular silence of a building that's been working honestly for a long time. "He came home last Christmas," she said. "First Christmas in 6 years. She pressed her fingers against the corner of her eye, once, the way people do when they're deciding not to cry in a freight depot. "I didn't know who built that place. I run a company. I do due diligence on everything. I never looked into the donor wall before yesterday. There are things you spend 11 years not thinking about because thinking about them would cost you something you can't spare. The recognition of strangers was one of them. I hadn't needed anyone to find me. The work was the point. The work getting done was the whole point. I picked up the clipboard again, not because I needed it. Somewhere to put my hands. "My brother's name is Danny," I said. "He's coming home at the end of the month. I've been waiting 11 years to make that sentence." She looked at me for a long moment. "Why didn't you?" She started. "He needed a reason to come back," I said. That was enough. I didn't need him to know where the lights came from. Mara Ellison stood in my loading dock for another minute, without saying anything. Then she sat down on a stack of pallets, like she was suddenly very tired, and I thought, that's woman who has run a long race, and just discovered the finish line was in a different place than she'd planned. I got her a cup of coffee from the break room. She took it. "The acquisition terms," she said finally. "Is there anything you want changed?" I'd thought about this. Not because I'd known this moment was coming, I hadn't. But because when someone asks you what you want, you should already know. "Lakeview stays in the community partnership," I said. "Same fleet hours, no reduction. And Ted Birch stays as director as long as he wants the job. That's it." She nodded, like it was nothing, like she'd been ready to offer me far more and was almost relieved. "Done," she said. We sat there for a minute, the two of us, in a loading dock that smelled like diesel and cold air, and the particular quiet of a building where people have been working honestly for a long time. "How's your brother?" she asked. "Better than he's been in 11 years, I said. "He's going to meet my son for the first time as himself. I've been waiting for that longer than anything." She smiled at that. Not the efficient smile from the conference room. Something else. "Danny came home on a Friday. Cal drove me to the airport, which meant I had to let a 16-year-old merge onto I-71 twice, which was its own kind of courage. We stood at arrivals with a sign Cal had made, hand-lettered, with a drawing of a freight truck that looked more like a submarine, because Cal had not inherited whatever gene produces spatial reasoning. And when Danny came through the doors and saw it, he stopped walking for a second and put his hand over his mouth. Then he laughed. A real laugh, full and unhurried. He'd lost some hair, gained some steadiness around the eyes. He shook Cal's hand and then pulled him in, and Cal let him. which is not a thing Cal lets people do without warning. We drove home through Dunmore in the October light, the white oaks on the west side, blazing the way they do. And Danny rolled down the window and let the cold air come in and didn't say anything for a long stretch of road. Then he said, "Ted told me. I kept my eyes on the road. He told me last year, about the patent, about where the money came from." A pause. "He probably wasn't supposed to." "Probably not," I said. "I was angry for about a week," Danny said. "That you didn't tell me." "I know, then I thought about what you would have said if I asked why." He was quiet for a moment. "You would have said because you're my brother." "That's what I would have said." "Yeah." He looked out the window. "That's what I thought." Cal looked between us from the back seat with the expression of a teenager who is watching something he doesn't entirely understand, but knows is important enough to stay quiet for. We pulled into the driveway. The maple Carol planted the year we moved in had gone full red, the way it did every October, like it was making a point. Danny sat in the car for a moment before he got out. Then he said, "It was a good program, Garrett. Not because of the money, because of the intent." He looked at me. "You built something that worked because you knew what the men needed. Not just Danny, all of them." I didn't have anything to say to that. We got out of the car, and the three of us went inside, and I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, and Danny asked Cal every question. A man asks a kid he's meeting for the first time as himself. The acquisition closed the following week. The donor wall at Lakeview still has my name on it. I went by once after the paperwork was done, just to check on Ted and walk the grounds. The white oaks were past their peak by then, most of the leaves down, the branches clean and spare against a gray sky. I stood there for a little while. I thought about Carol, about the routing patent and what it bought, about 11 years of moved money and kept silence and the long arithmetic of love. Danny was home. That was the whole equation. That was always the whole equation. I got back in my truck and drove to work.